One of the perks of going to a university which had its own college dining hall was the ability to eat chipolatas and baked beans, waffles, hash browns and eggs every single morning of my degree. And at the same time, I could quietly listen to any college gossip from nearby students. However, this came back to bite me because I remember one instance, 8 o'clock in the morning, before I started my essay. Sat in the dining hall, I overheard a student, a couple of years younger than me, talking about the different degree subjects. He was a science student, I overheard. And then I heard him say, "Why would anyone want to study music? What a waste of time." I wanted at that moment to rise up from my sausage and bacon and say to him, "Excuse me, sir, there is a music student sat right opposite you." But instead, in the typical English way, I fumed entirely in my own head, sat in quiet desperation. And when I returned to my room, I fumed some more, slightly more audibly. It's true, and to be honest, you don't really forget those stories, do you, for the rest of your life? And I like to think that they spur you on much more than the encouraging ones. But this video is all about how I became a professional musician in 3 years, even before I went to university. And how, having gained what seemed like the perfect professional organist position for me, I was asked to leave. Welcome to Bremer, an ancient settlement on the edge of the New Forest in Hampshire. For more than 400 years, this village has been watched over by its imposing manor house. But it's not nearly as old as the church, which dates back unbelievably to 1000 AD. I've come here for the very same reasons that I visit any village church, for inspiration, for creativity, and to let my mind wander. Buildings like this are timeless. They make you feel relaxed and unpressured. They fill you with a sense of freedom, escape from the confines of office jobs and politics. It's no surprise that unlatching a church door has become a staple of almost every YouTube video I've ever produced. Everything that you've just seen, the sunshine, the beauty, the timelessness, is really the essence of every single one of the 82 village churches which I've visited so far on this channel over the last couple of years. But I've got news for you. This is a video about how I became a professional musician between the ages of 15 and 18. And unfortunately, all of those qualities about Bremer Church are the direct opposite to those required in becoming a professional musician. I'd love to say that I went to a church like Bremer and sat quietly learning to play the pipe organ, with the sound of birds around me and a hot flask of tea. But that's not the reality of how you become a musician. The reality is far more boring. This is the practice organ which I used to become a proper musician. I was very lucky to get this instrument for free, and it must be well over 40 years old. It's analog, I think, and it's called a Viscount Crescendo DK800. This Viscount was excellent as my first practice instrument. So while I was still at school at Bishop's in Salisbury, I had some time playing the chapel organ there, but I also got to play this instrument at home. And this really kicked off my obsession with the pipe organ. From here I could really begin to develop my organ playing. There are 8 grades which you pass as an organist. However, I only took 4, 7 and 8. I skipped all the rest of them. But the most significant development took place immediately afterwards. A job came up when I was 17 years old as an organist of a funeral chapel. That might sound incredibly morbid, but to me it was a dream job because funerals really get to the heart of what music should be: emotion and comfort. I thought this would be the ideal job for me, so I looked at the audition process and I saw that apart from submitting the CV and covering letter, you also had to prepare a set of pieces. So you would be asked to play a hymn. I didn't know what the hymn was going to be, so I learnt every single hymn in the book. A Bach piece called Sheep May Safely Graze, and finally an organ piece of your choice, which would be appropriate for a funeral. I chose a chorale prelude by Bach called Liebster Jesu, wir sind hier, which means Dearest Jesus, we are here. It seemed to fulfill the brief, and because you deserve to hear some music, here is the full piece by Bach played on the very organ on which I had my first organ lessons. Dearest Jesus, We Are Here by Johann Sebastian Bach. That's the piece which opened my funeral chapel audition. Next came the hymn. I told you that I learned every hymn in the book, but I didn't tell you that I learnt the wrong book. And the hymn I was asked to play was one which was in the book I had studied, but it was to a different harmonisation. So on the day I had to effectively sight read a hymn tune which I knew well, but with different chords to the ones I was expecting. It was a hymn called Lord of All Hopefulness. Lord of All Hopefulness, which I'd come to learn was a very popular hymn at funeral services because it's not melancholy, is it? It's quite uplifting, but also reflective. So the final piece that I played for my audition was specified again by the examiners, if you can call them that, but it was really just the staff at this chapel. And this piece was called Sheep May Safely Graze. A short snippet from Sheep May Safely Graze, which once again is extremely popular for funeral services. I was told fairly shortly afterwards that I'd been successful in my audition and I'd passed with flying colours, was what they said. And I was completely delighted that I'd got my first professional organist job when I was 17 years old. The job began when I was 18 and I took it on during my gap year before I went off to Oxford. And though it was extremely hectic, I did enjoy the work. I was a part-time funeral organist and there were sometimes 10 funerals each day. So I must have played for well over 500 of them just that year. Here's how a funeral works in one of these chapels. The mourners gather outside, and then as soon as they start coming in, the organist, who is behind a curtain, starts playing very gentle organ improvisations or pieces to set the correct mood. When the hearse arrives, the music stops, and there is normally a chosen piece of music at this point when the coffin is brought in, which should last exactly the right length to see the coffin bearers and any members of the family that want to join them into the chapel. And then you'd have hymns, you'd have a short piece of music as the coffin was lowered on the catafalque, as it's called. And then finally you would have a concluding voluntary as everybody left. I really enjoyed providing a personal musical service to bereaved families, and I took particular pride in my organ improvisations because I could really tailor them to the right mood at that moment. I had CCTV screens so that I could see exactly what was going on in the chapel, and all of the different colours which are available to you on an electronic organ. In fact, some of my improvisations turned into short pieces which I wrote down to use again and again. And one of them, which was actually intended for when the coffin was lowering, an otherwise quite awkward silence and rather painful, I'm afraid. This piece of music I wrote to cover that moment, provide something beautiful and emotional, and I called it At Peace. At Peace, a short composition I penned for the committal section of a funeral service. I wrote that piece as an interlude, but it also marks an interlude in my funeral organist career because at this point I went off to university, so I left the job for 3 years. But after I'd graduated, I was quite keen to get the job back again. I had the words of that science student in the dining hall haunting me still, and I was hoping to get a job. Fortunately, the chapel organist job was available. However, there was one very clear and foreboding change in the way that I would be working. As well as having the organ in front of me with the CCTV, I now had to the right of me a very technological set of computer systems which could dial up almost any piece of music at the press of a button. I had to control both the organ and the sound system. A mixture of live playing and recorded playing. But things began to get slightly troublesome. More and more often, recordings were being requested rather than organ music. It wasn't because organ music was not very expressive or effective. I think it was because it was easier to request a simple recorded piece. And also because the organist is behind a curtain, nobody knows that there's a professional musician there to play. And all of the personal musical discretion of an experienced musician is lost as a result. You could even request recordings of hymns with a choir so that the congregation needn't try too hard to sing, or perhaps they were too emotional to sing. It provided support until it didn't. They were often too high for people to sing, too slow for people to sing. They might be recordings from a cathedral where there was a massive unrealistic acoustic, descants in the last verse, or organ interludes on some mighty Henry Willis instrument which completely flummoxed a small congregation of mourners. Sometimes the hymn had the wrong tune altogether. Sometimes there were the wrong number of verses, so people would stand in silence for a whole verse not knowing what to do, or there were too few verses, so the last one would be sung unaccompanied. The words would be wrong. Some hymns have slightly different words printed compared to those in a recording. And then further problems came when recordings of classical pieces like the Blue Danube Waltz by Strauss were requested. If you know that piece, you know that the main theme comes in a few minutes in, not at the very beginning. If an organist played that waltz, they would play the theme straight away so that everybody got to hear the part they knew and which I'm sure the deceased had requested. But if it's a recording, nobody gets to hear the part they want to hear, the effective part. An organist uses their discretion to provide the best possible service, don't they? A computer, I'm afraid, cannot do that. So what happened next? Well, I was called into a meeting and I was told I would be being made redundant. The reason? Diminishing need for an organist. So whether I was sat playing or pressing and pausing recordings, musicianship was not important. The student in the dining hall had been correct all along. If you're enjoying this video, please do make sure you click on the subscribe button. It doesn't cost a penny. Keeps you up to date with all of my future videos. If you'd like to, you can also support me financially using PayPal. There's a link underneath this video. If you click on that, it takes you to my PayPal donations page. And if you'd like to, you can leave me a small donation, which helps me to continue making these videos for you. And I endeavour to produce one of them every single week. Thank you so much for your help. I wrote a diary when I worked at the funeral chapel, where I would sometimes write down pieces of music which had been requested, which I hadn't known before, but which I loved. However, I also included some poems which I heard during these services and which stayed with me forever, sometimes as a piece of encouragement. And one, I didn't just write it down, I actually cut it out of the service sheet and I stuck it into my diary. I'm going to finish by reading you that poem, whose last stanza tells you everything you need to know about why I'm still here, walking that narrow path as a musician. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. If you can wait, and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good, nor talk too wise. If you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same, if you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken and stoop and build them up with worn out tools, if you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose and start again at your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and, which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Cheerio.